So wait till you skip a lead. For stage 25, we're going to talk about indirect questions. So you need to be able to identify direct and indirect questions in English. Obviously, you need to be able to explain the difference between direct and indirect questions in English as well. To do these before you can do the Latin is ideal. But then we got to move on to the Latin, so identifying them in Latin and explaining how each is constructed, understanding the parts that make it up. Last would be the translation part, both Latin to English and English to Latin, so I'm mostly concerned with the aforementioned direction. So let's talk about direct questions so that then we can get into the indirect ones, because you've already seen these. And the following things apply in both English and Latin. First, they directly ask a question. Surprise, surprise. Second, they use a question mark because they are directly asking a question. Third, they're often introduced by a question word, aka an interrogative. Words like what and who and how. Fourth, they can also expect yes-no responses, so there may not be any interrogative word present. It could simply be, do you want to go to the dance with me? Which clearly is looking for a yes answer, but could receive a no answer. Here's some exempla. Quis Romam condidit? Who established or who founded Rome? Notice we have a direct question. It has a question mark. It also has an interrogative, quis. Nonne conis similis est lupo. Notice in this one, we don't really have an interrogative or, quote, question word. Nonne, you can sort of consider that way, but it's really a marker. This is a question that expects a yes-no response, specifically a yes. Isn't a dog similar to a wolf? You guys still have your question mark, though, and we'll review nonne in a second. Videsne eam? Do you see her? So, again, it doesn't really have a question word. We've got this inclicit, which is that little ne on the end of vides. It goes on the end of the first word, and it makes it asking a yes-no question. Do you see her? Yes, I do. Do you see her? No, I don't. Pretty simple, but we've got a direct question with a question mark. So let's look at the things you need to remember about these in Latin. First, you need to know all of the interrogatives I have listed here. Ubi, quid, quis, cur, quomodo, quote, quando, unde, si, quo, and quare. Look them up if you do not remember what they mean. The only one I'm going to talk about right now is quid, and that's the fact that even though it literally means what, it doesn't always mean what. Sometimes it appears as a why or a how, such as in quid august, where the verb and it work together and it means how are you? So those are easy to recognize, right? Those are the interrogatives. They start something and then you got the question mark. The other ones that are easy to recognize are yes, no. So the questions like nonne, or a question like conim ne amos, which says dog is a direct object. Ne is thrown onto the first word always. Amos says do you. So do you love the dog? Okay, it doesn't know whether the answer is going to be yes or no, but it's asking for a yes-no answer. I wouldn't say conim ne amos and you answer me with something like video. I see. That makes no sense, though. I do have a friend that used to answer all my texts that way. Those that expect a yes answer will start with nonne, such as nonne conim amos. You love the dog, don't you? Don't you added on the end is a clear example that the person expects a yes answer. They expect you to say, of course I love the dog. If somebody asked me this about milk duds, it would make sense because they're expecting me to say yes, and I talk about him all the time. Can the person answering still say no? Of course, but it expects a yes. And the last one, those that start with num, expect a no answer. So like num conim amos, you don't like that dog, do you? Like, these are derogatory questions. Like, really? Oh my God, you like that? They're expecting you to say no. They want you to answer with a no. So those are the main types. We saw this group of yes/nos last year, and then we saw the direct questions that use the interrogatives listed. So what are indirect questions? Because that covers most of the question types in Latin, direct question types you'll encounter. Well, the indirect question does not ask a question directly. Take that. There is no question mark. You're like, but Miss Balcom, how can it even be called a question if there's no question mark? Like, what's going on? Oh my gosh. Well, it's because it is made up of an independent clause and a dependent clause. So if you're not sure about these in English, look them up. Brief explanation. An independent clause is basically a sentence. It can stand on its own. A dependent clause is not a sentence, though it does have a subject and a verb. It cannot stand on its own. Again, if you're confused here, look it up or ask me for more explanation in class. The question is contained, so the question itself is contained within the dependent clause. So there are two parts to an indirect question, but the actual question part is in the dependent clause. The main clause will have a verb of saying, knowing, thinking, or perceiving. Okay? So main clause, saying, knowing, thinking, perceiving verb. Dependent clause, actual question. The dependent clause will begin with an interrogative. This is just the way it works. It's going to always be true, and it's going to make it really easy to recognize, because you're going to be like, oh, that's a sentence, but it has a question word in the middle. Well, yeah, that's because it's an indirect question. So what do these actually look like? Here's the formula. You have a verb of saying, thinking, knowing, perceiving, asking. You have your interrogative, and then, and this formula follows with English as well, but then you also have some form of, guess what, our new favorite friend, the subjunctive. We're only going to talk about the pluperfect and the imperfect subjunctive, because those are the two we know. So we're going to worry about those right now. So here are my two examples for you. Vir incolam rogabat, quis illam terram regerit. So let's look for a formula. The man asked the inhabitant or settler. Asked. That's a verb of saying, thinking, knowing, perceiving, or asking. Who, quis, oh, there's our interrogative, was ruling, oh, there's our subjunctive, that land. So we've got the three parts. We've got the asking, the interrogative, and the subjunctive. Again, English will be the same way, right? Look, in English, asked, right? There's the verb of saying and asking. Who, there's that. Now, this isn't really subjunctive in English, but that's okay. English is still following the main pattern that we need. Note, if you look at this example, and I'm going to clear away some of my red marks here, that we have the main or independent clause, like I was talking about on that first slide. The man asked the inhabitant. That could be its own sentence. You don't need anything else. Who was ruling that land? Who was ruling that land is the dependent clause. However, we cannot say who was ruling that land and put a period after it. That's why it can't stand alone. We can't do that. We could make it a direct question, but then we would have to put a question mark. Since it is not being directly asked, since it is not saying who was ruling that land, question mark, it is an indirect question. Well, who's asking it? Well, the man asked it, right? We're talking about someone else. That's why it's an indirect question. We're saying what somebody else was thinking, knowing, perceiving, or asking. Sometimes we even say it about ourselves. I could say, so yesterday I asked my teacher what the homework was, period. That's an indirect question. I'm not actually asking the teacher, what's my homework, right? I'm talking about an action that I did. using a verb of saying, thinking, knowing, perceiving, or asking, and an interrogative and 2 clauses. So it's actually a sentence. An indirect question is actually a statement about a question that has been asked. That's a good way of thinking about it. It is a statement about something that has been asked. It's actually a sentence. Let's look at our second example, and then I'll let you guys go. Regina Skiwit, the queen knew. So, the queen knew. The queen knew, period. We could stop the sentence there. It's a short sentence. We don't know what she knows, but it's a sentence. Why quod calsa Kaiser ad Aegyptum veniret? Why, concerning what reason, Caesar was coming to Egypt. Notice our dependent clause here, right? Can't stand alone. It doesn't make sense alone unless it's a direct question, but it's not. We're trying to put a period after it. So we're trying to make a statement about something that has been asked, or in this case, known. And it starts with a question word. This qua part is actually our question word. And there is something I'm going to have to show you guys that you need to bear with. You don't have to memorize right now, but I do want you to be able to recognize it in translation and translate it for me right now, which is going to relate to this qua. So we'll talk about that in a second. Why, or concerning what reason, Caesar was coming to Egypt. So notice we have our thinking and knowing. Here's our thinking. We have our interrogative, per se, qua. And we have our subjunctive, veniret. In the English, we have basically the same thing. We have our thinking or knowing main clause. We have our question. And then we don't really have the subjunctive, but that's okay. So here I'm going to show you guys where you may be a little like, oh my gosh, Miss Balcom, really? Yeah, I brought you back to the relative pronoun. Sorry. But if you know this chart, then you don't even have to learn anything about what I'm going to tell you right now. Not really, because guess what? There's one thing I haven't shown you, some interrogatives you've maybe seen in translation, and I think we talked about very briefly last year, but we did not review, which are interrogative pronouns. We already know quis and quid, right? Our old friends who and what. Well, they also decline, so they have a chart. So if I want to say, who is that? Quis, right? Quis est ille. But if I want to say, whose cat is that? I would use cuius, because I'm asking whose cat it is. So it's a genitive, it's a possession word. Or to whom should I give the cat? Cui. To whom should I give the cat? Or, you know, whom did the cat bite? Quim. Or, you know, with whom was the cat walking on a leash? Because that's weird, but still, quo. So it does have its own whole chart. So if you see some kind of relative looking pronoun thing, this is my point, at the beginning of a question, translate it like you would the other relative pronouns we learned. It's just starting the question because it's actually an interrogative pronoun. And what's more, you could see any of these forms in an indirect question. Okay, so if you see one of these forms, but then it's preceded by a verb of thinking or knowing or asking, and it's followed by the subjunctive, you have an indirect question. It's just using an interrogative pronoun, and they just happen to look just like relative pronouns. Another side note, which again we'll go into more depth on these, is there are also interrogative adjectives, and the difference is very slight, guys. It's the difference between, if you look at these first questions, asking who is Minerva, right? Quis est Minerva. And quae dea, what goddess or which goddess, right? Est Minerva, or in their case, est auctor amoris, is the author of love. So it's the difference between the interrogative actually asking a general who is Minerva, and it being specific what goddess or which one. Either way, they look the same, so you should be able to recognize it. That's why I'm telling you guys, all I need you to do right now is recognize it. I'm not going to go into depth about the interrogatives. I just want you to remember that A, they look just like the relative pronouns. B, they translate the same way, who, which, what. And C, if they're preceded by thinking or knowing and then followed by a subjunctive, you've got a question. So just use good sense. If it says quis, it's nominative who. If it says cuius, well, that's genitive, so translate it as whose. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Have a great day.